what has been happening to media freedom in India since the Modi government assumed power. The number of journalists killed in India, it was 11, murdered in India in connection to their work, not in some private dispute, not in conflicts, not in crossfire, but actually murdered in connection with their work, targeted and murdered, 11. Bad enough. There are 12 countries which are identified as the worst in this respect, Global Impunity Index, and 2023. ஒரு முக்கியமான புத்தகம். பிரபீர் புர்காஷ் சாரை எனக்கு சந்துரு அவர்களுக்கும் எனக்கும் ரொம்ப நாளாக தெரியும். அவரை பற்றி தெரியும், அவரை பர்சனலாக கூட தெரியும். அந்த புத்தகம் ஒரு முக்கியமான சில கருத்துக்களை நம் முன்னால் வைத்திருக்கிறது. Now I won't regret not speaking in Tamil, unlike Sudanwa, who cannot. I can speak a little Tamil, but I think given the audience, it will be more useful if I switch to English, and both my friend Justice Chandru and Ramakrishnan agreed with that. So I will now try to give you some information on this book, as well as some background on what we are talking about. As has been mentioned, this book largely deals with what happened during the emergency and after that. And it makes a reference to the latest attack on NewsClick and on Prabir himself. This is clearly one of the largest attacks on the media since independence, because more than 80 people, 8 journalists, contributors and others associated with NewsClick were raided by the special cell of the Delhi police on October 3rd, 2023. Many of them were detained for about 12 hours. You know what happened to Prabir as well as Administrative Officer Amit Chakravarti. We have read in the press that Amit has turned approver. It's very unfortunate, but I don't think that is going to make a big difference to the case, although it does raise some questions. Clearly he has turned approver under duress. He has certain disabilities which make him more vulnerable. I don't know the circumstances, but he cannot but note that. But I am confident that that is not going to make a big difference to the outcome of the case when it goes to trial. And I learned that in addition to files and documents, more than 400 electronic devices have been seized during the raid, involving hundreds of police personnel. But this was not the only attack. Prabir, in fact, links 2 points. One, in September of 1975, when he was picked up, he was misidentified. Based on wrong identity, they detained him, and despite his making that clear, and despite officials knowing it, they detained him for about a year, or a little more than a year. And he heard that there was a special message from the Prime Minister's office saying that you must maintain him, even though they knew that they had picked up the wrong person. But in February, according to them, they picked up somebody who they considered dangerous. And Sudanwa has very clearly explained why Prabir and NewsClick created such concern in their minds, because they focused on the lives and struggles of the ordinary people, the working people, including farmers, agricultural laborers, and so on. And why this was seen as such a big threat, that's, I think, an interesting question. I'll come to that in a minute. But clearly, the two main movements that they covered exceptionally well. One was the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, the NRC, which came in its wake. That bill was in 2019. And the protests against this were very spirited, they were quite widespread, and they were prolonged. And it is only the COVID-19 pandemic that made it impossible for this protest to continue beyond that. The second and even more important movement here was the protests against the agitation against the 3 farm laws, and the protesters succeeded because of their heroism, their resilience, and their prolonged fight, forcing the Modi government, to withdraw the 3 acts. And it is clear that although NewsClick was not the only digital media organization that covered this, there were also others like The Wire, Scroll, and so on, as well as some sections of the mainstream media. But NewsClick covered this more effectively and more consistently and more meaningfully than perhaps any other media organization in the country. Because they did videos, they were on the spot, they kept their eye on this and the core issues. And this, I think, enraged those in authority. So far, I don't know any other media organization that has been attacked by so many agencies. The Economic Offences Wing of the Delhi Police, the Enforcement Directorate, the Income Tax Authorities, and last, the Special Cell of the Delhi Police. Also, we read that the CBI has taken cognizance of it, and they visited Prabir's residence. He was not there, he was in jail. So actually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 organizations. These are some of the details. We have already heard about Prabir's background as an influential intellectual of the left, as somebody who's worked in the software movement, the free software movement, an engineer, a specialist on the power and telecom sectors, and somebody who was very, very sensitive to the rights of people, of ordinary working people. So he had his activities were broad. He had a very broad-ranging approach, and so on. And we know this very well. Prabir was an engineer by training, but he moved to several areas in this respect and really made an impact in the areas he chose to work in. He had long experience as a professional, and we know that background. The vicious and sweeping Delhi police raids on the offices of NewsClick that I have referred to had some strange features. Indiscriminate, well, not completely strange because we had seen that in the case of Wire and so on, and some others, but not on this scale. Indiscriminate seizure of the electronic devices, I already referred to it, without any adherence to due process. That has been referred to. They did not give secure memos, seizure memos, hash values of the seized data, or even copies of the data. They sealed the news portal's main office, and they of course arrested the editor, the founder editor, and the administrative officer on terrorism-related charges. And they also conducted searches on the premises of NewsClick and the home of Prabir's home, after a fresh criminal case was filed by the CBI. That is, as I mentioned, the 5th probe agency directed from above to set about this digital news organization. And clearly this has marked, I did a column for Frontline on it, and also Prospect magazine in the UK on this. This marks the lowest point for media freedom in India since the emergency of 75-77, when total censorship was imposed on the media. Justice Chandru has said Tamil Nadu is a little less affected, at least for some of the time, but overall total censorship There was some underground activities. Communication was exchanged underground, but the legal media or the registered media were not allowed to function, the newspapers in particular. Here we have to see the broader picture about what has been happening to media freedom in India since the Modi government assumed power. And this is an interesting story. I'll give you just 2 or 3 examples or indicators of what has happened. There has been a post 2014 downslide of media freedom, and in the World Press Freedom Index compiled by the Reporters Without Borders, this downslide has been tracked, and India sank. In 2013, India was ranked 140 out of 180 countries. And in 2023, according to the 2023 index, India's rank sank further to 161 out of 180. This is their index. You can look at the methodology and so on. But there is a clear downslide in the ranking by the same organization. From 140 out of 1, that is not something to be proud of. 140 out of, from below. 180 is quite shameful, but 161 is much worse, qualitatively worse. And that is one indicator. Journalists have been murdered in connection with their work. And I saw the figures yesterday, while preparing for another meeting. Between 2004, when the UPA came to power, and 2013, technically they spilled over to 2014, but if you see the number of journalists killed in India, it was 11, murdered in India in connection with their work, not in some private dispute, not in conflicts, not in crossfire, but actually murdered in connection with their work, targeted and murdered, 11, bad enough. But from 2014 to today, May 2014, after the Modi government assumed office, to today, it was 19, nearly double. I'm not saying that the BJP was responsible for all this, but it occurred during this rule, during this regime, which claims that it has complete control. They want everything to be ruled from Delhi. So this is another indicator, and of course, a large number of journalists have been detained. The situation in Kashmir is outrageous for journalists. I'm talking here about journalists, and we know what is happening. In some cases, state governments are also to blame, or should be held accountable for this state of affairs. But this is not all, not just murders. There is the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, has a database on this. The number of journalists. Each case is investigated globally and they document it. This is the database. But they also compile something called the Global Impunity Index. This may be of interest to Justice Chandru and lawyers here, if they have not come across this. There are 12 countries which are identified as the worst in this respect, Global Impunity Index, and 2023. These 12 countries are Syria. First I'll say what it is about. Journalists are murdered in connection with their work, but the cases are unsolved. Because, in other words, they have impunity. Padagappu. So in India is, and the 12 countries for this year, 2023, that's the last report: Syria, Somalia, Haiti, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Mexico, Philippines, Myanmar, Brazil, Pakistan, and India. India is a founding and permanent member of this club of shame. Year after year, it figures in the Global Impunity Index from the time the index began to be compiled. this I think needs to be highlighted. This is the wider context. Now let's turn to the first information report registered by the special cell of the Delhi police against Prabir and others. It's an instructive document. It takes you into the raw and muddled police mind, lets you imagine what a dystopian police state, a vicious, crude, and unintelligent police state whose motto is sentence first, verdict afterwards, would look like. That's from Alice in Wonderland, if you have read it. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. And if you look at the criminal case registered in this FIR, it was not made available first, but it is leaked into the hands of journalists. The police first refused to release it, and it's outrageous. The assault on NewsClick is not a police story, essentially. It's a political dispensation targeting journalists, and it's a story of the BJP and Hindutva authoritarian regime at war, I'm not exaggerating, with a medium-sized, progressive and left-oriented digital news network. It's also a war against independent, critical and challenging journalism that NewsClick represents. NewsClick was founded in 2009. It's owned by a small private company called PPK NewsClick Studio Private Limited. It works on a modest budget. It's managed in its day-to-day functioning by an editorial collective. And its founder and editor-in-chief, of course, is Prabir Purkayastha, whose background we know. And it focuses on reporting, analyzing and commenting on people's movements and struggles. Unsurprisingly, it's opposed to the Modi government's authoritarian Hindutva or Hindu supremacist politics. It's critical of its policies. But it is fact-based. It does proper journalism, investigative journalism, despite limited resources. And the business model is based on subscriptions, sales of journalistic content to select customers abroad, and some investments to support its operations and extend its footprint. That's the basic. These are the basic facts about NewsClick. Now, nobody so far has mentioned an important person here, Neville Roy Singham, a US citizen, a left-oriented intellectual and activist. I know him very well. He's been here before. He's a very talented entrepreneur, and he was the founder and prominent owner of a world-class IT consultancy called ThoughtWorks. It had a global footprint, and then in 2017, ThoughtWorks was sold to a British private equity fund for a sum reported by the New York Times to be $785 million. $785 million, you can convert it into rupees. And he decided to give away most of the proceeds from the sale of his equity to public causes, progressive causes. So he and his team created a private foundation in the US called the People's Support Foundation Limited. It's important to know that according to an official statement issued by the team's lawyer called Jason Fetcher on behalf of the foundation, this is crucially important in the case. All funds donated to PSF came from the sale of ThoughtWorks. Every dollar, every cent donated to this foundation came from the sale of ThoughtWorks, almost completely from Neville Roy Singham. And the lawyer has also gone on record to say PSF has never received funds from a foreign government. This, I think, is crucial in the case because the FIR falsely alleges, and the shameful sections of the media which just do propaganda for the government and for the police and their masters, They have repeatedly lied about it and not published the statement, except a few. The Hindu published it, Frontline, some other, or the Wire published it, perhaps some others like the Telegraph, I don't know. But main sections of the media, and particularly the TV channels, have deliberately refused to communicate this information to the people. Here is a lawyer who has gone on record. Then the New York Times, it did some great damage because the case was lying dormant. Prabir, because the courts had given relief to Prabir, no coercive action should be taken. That is, the Delhi High Court said. So he was out. They couldn't really arrest him or do anything else. But a story published by the New York Times fueled or refueled the case. And then all hell broke loose because now they could say that you are a danger to national security. You have received money from China, which is completely untrue. Roy Singham is based in Shanghai, but everything has come from this money, and it has been declared to the Reserve Bank. They have complied with all the laws. This has been repeatedly made clear, and I think it's a shameful story of a public narrative being completely twisted, what we could call disinformation. The New York Times story had two lazy references, saying that income tax authorities said they had received foreign money, but there's no evidence. And the second thing was that they got some support from Neville Roy Singham, and they published some Chinese talking points. That was the word used. As though there is no evidence that any talking points was communicated or was a condition for this grant, and you will look at the content of NewsClick itself, which is all available on its digital site or in its archives. And so this, I think, provoked the latest attack. It fell into the hands of the government, and some very, very bad journal. Again, New York Times refused to publish the statement by the lawyer, who made it clear that all the money came from the sales of ThoughtWorks donated to the foundation, and that was invested in this company because they wanted to support good journalism, progressive journalism, and it was all the laws are being complied with. So this is the basic story that we are dealing with, and it is very unfortunate that Prabir has not been able to get bail because under the UAPA, you know what it means. I don't have to explain that. It's an ongoing story. This book does not contain all these details, Prabir's book. He says we'll answer them in court. As Justice Chandru, Comrade Chandru said, that has to be a sequel, the real story of the reality and what the case is about. So, but I think that remains to be done. But we are free to put this out. And I think this has to be explained to anyone who has to assess what is happening to NewsClick in particular and what is happening in a more broader way to the media. This is all I have to say. I think it's excellent that you brought out this book in Tamil, and I hope it will be well distributed and widely read.